This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
In this episode, I have back with me what's become an annual tradition, Philip Urofsky. Philip is a partner at Shearman Sterling, and he's the editor of the Shearman Sterling FCPA Digest and has been so for quite some time. We review the 2020 FCPA Digest, taking a look at the large amount of quantum in FCPA settlements, the growing cooperation between the Department of Justice and other agencies in enforcement actions and what that might mean going forward. We consider the Goldman Sachs and Airbus actions and the Thomas Moyer prosecution in California. He's the head of Apple's global security. We conclude with a look at enforcement under the Biden administration and the changes to the Bank Secrecy Act, which may inform FCPA enforcement going forward. I know you'll enjoy it. I also hope you will check out my new podcast, ComTech, on the intersection of compliance and technology with my co-host, Valerie Charles. It's available on the Compliance Podcast Network. Check it out. I know you will enjoy it. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and I'm thrilled to have back with me Philip Urofsky. He's a partner at Shearman Sterling, and we're here to talk about the always great Shearman Sterling FCPA Digest for 2020. Philip, first of all, this is becoming an annual event, so welcome back.
Thank you. We can do it twice a year if you wanted.
I was wondering if you could start with just telling our audience who may not know, how is the Digest compiled and produced annually?
Well, look, the Digest was a creation of my partner, Dan Newcomb, back in the day when there was one or two cases a year. It used to be mimeographed and hand distributed. But even when I was at DOJ, we used the Digest as the compendium of all the cases, and we even handed it out to our counterparts in other countries as we were negotiating the OECD and Council of Europe conventions. Today, it's grown. It's gone online. When I came back to Shearman after DOJ, what had been the Trends and Patterns introduction, which was really a statistical introduction to the Digest, which was published in hard copy, we moved into a more analytical type of article that tries to identify the trends and match them up with what we saw things were happening in the United States and elsewhere. And how it's done is that I take no credit for it at all. Is I have a very talented team of editors who have a devotion to digging into FCPA cases and making sure that we're up to date and covered by it. And then I put my name on it.
Well, good for having your name on it. If we could turn to the Digest now, 2020 saw total sanctions of approximately $4.25 billion, making it a record-shattering terms in a year in terms of quantum of penalties. Do you have any thoughts on what this might mean going forward, or because we had a change in administration, does that kind of wrap into it, or does each year really stand on its own independently?
Well, I don't think each year stands on its own independently. I think we definitely have seen trends in the types of enforcement cases that are brought and things like international cooperation that has developed over the years. But I'm not sure that the quantum of the penalty in 2020 really means anything. One thing, two of those cases, Goldman and Airbus, accounted for 87% of that amount. So two cases accounted, and we've seen this in the past as well, where one or two big cases, distorts what's actually going on. More often, we see cases in the area of $10 to $25 million, which is sort of a standard FCPA case. We didn't see as many of those this year, and all those statistical metrics tended to go up last year, partially because there were just less cases, and the Goldman and Airbus case, sort of took all the oxygen out. And the less cases last year, I think, are entirely attributable to the pandemic rather than politics. We didn't really see and in the Trump administration, a change in FCPA enforcement. At the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a bunch of noise about it because he had given an interview several years before where he said it was the worst statute ever. And his nominee for the SEC chair, Jay Clayton, had been part of a bar association committee that had written a paper that was critical of FCPA enforcement. But in fact, once, and then there was a lull because it took a long time, if you remember, for the Trump administration to actually staff the DOJ, particularly in the criminal division and above. And so, but once that was out of the way, things just chugged along in the fraud section with cases at a fairly standard level. Where I see, is that going to change in the Biden administration? Probably not. Again, there's going to be a short delay because, we don't have political appointees in place yet, at the criminal division and even at the deputy and attorney general level. And what we've seen in the past is that big cases, important cases that, tend to be put on hold until there's a political appointee in place to approve. So there may be a delay, and the pandemic is still with us, of course, we're all, and that's going to delay. But the major things that happened over the past 4 years in the Trump administration, DOJ, relating to FCPA, which would be things like the no piling on policy, the permanent introduction of the FCPA corporate prosecution policy, the restatement or revision of the monitorships policy, those are likely to stay in place. I think what we may see more, whereas the pendulum in the Trump administration sort of swung toward prosecuting individuals over companies and a lot more declinations of companies, we may see less declinations of companies and in this administration. But I think generally, whatever else happened at DOJ during the last administration, the FCPA unit itself seemed to have been fairly well insulated from politics.
Philip, we've seen, obviously, close cooperation between the Department of Justice and other agencies and regulators in investigations of corruption cases. But this year we saw enforcement with different types of laws and different agencies. So Airbus, we had OFAC. With Goldman Sachs, we had the OCC and the Fed, and then we had one with the CFTC and the Department of Justice at the end of the year. I was wondering, does this new trend, is it a trend? And if so, will we see other agencies other than the Department of Justice or Securities and Exchange Commission getting into anti-corruption enforcement now?
Quite honestly, I'm not sure. Look, bribery and sanctions, OFAC have always been linked in policy. The idea is that, bribes are a means by which sanctioned countries and sanctions entities manage to evade sanctions. And we've seen that for a while. And with the passage of the Global Magnitsky Act, that was a direct authorization to the executive branch to put individuals and entities associated with corruption on the sanctions list. So it's not that surprising to see that overlap with OFAC. I think the CFTC is more of a surprise. And, I think the role of the CFTC is somewhat puzzling. The FCPA itself doesn't give the CFTC, as opposed to the SEC, any enforcement responsibility, nor does the CFTC's governing statute, the CFA, suggest any role or any with respect to corruption. And also, I don't see any gap in enforcement that the CFTC needs to step in to fill. There's, in the case that came out last year, Vitol, there was a parallel FCPA case by DOJ that seems to have covered the ground. So it's not really clear why, the CFTC needs to step in. As a practical matter, of course, the head of enforcement at the CFTC up until recently was a former AUSA. FCPA cases are get press and they get fines, and the CFTC may very well just looked over and seen their counterpart in the securities markets, the SEC making hay with respect to FCPA cases and saying, wait a minute, we want a part of this. Its theory is that if a company that trades commodities or commodities futures, pays bribes to obtain commodities or inside information about them, that can amount to manipulation of the commodities markets or the futures markets. Again, it seems a stretch, but, perhaps the idea here is that if they bring a CFTC case, they can achieve some degree of supervision beyond what the DOJ might do, or might be able to exclude those companies from the markets in a way that the DOJ might not do. But altogether, it is a bit of a puzzle as to why, what role the CFTC is going to play going forward.
I come out of the energy space and in Houston, and the longest time I'd wondered about energy traders because they do a lot of business with state-owned enterprises, and they buy from them and sell from them. So I wasn't surprised to see that as an issue. They are still viewed as, even within energy companies, as the Wild West, and in many ways the cowboys of the companies. But the CFTC angle was interesting. And in the Goldman case, we saw the Department of Financial Services from the state of New York involved. DFS does have jurisdiction over banks that are chartered in New York, but was it surprising to see them in this FCPA action?
Well, I've dealt with DFS in sanctions matters, and they're an aggressive agency, and it doesn't surprise me to see them get involved in anything, frankly. But I think what happened there is, look, there's always been cooperation between DOJ and the regulators. Some degree of cooperation. Sometimes it's less harmonious than others, but you see the parallel investigations, the parallel cases in AML instances, for instance, or something like that. We haven't seen it in FCPA cases as much, because most of the banking cases that we've seen so far don't really touch on regulators' issues. They were, for instance, hiring cases, the princes and princesses cases, were interesting. And I have separate issues involving the FCPA and whether those are violations of the FCPA or not, but they didn't go to safety and soundness of the financial institutions involved. They didn't affect compliance of the other banks like a sanctions case might. They didn't involve money laundering, other than, at a very technical level. And they didn't usually involve the U.S. operations of those banks. The Goldman case is different. It was massive money flows. It was a significant financial matter for the regulated bank. It involved allegations of money laundering in the United States. These are all things that catch the attention of banking regulators. And so, given the wide publicity and spread of the 1MDB scandal, I wasn't really surprised to see DFS show up in that case.
I'd like to turn now to one of the enforcement actions that I thought was the most interesting, and that's the Thomas Moyer enforcement action. He is the global head of security at Apple, former CCO, and a prosecution was brought against him for alleged providing of benefits to a county sheriff in Santa Clara County, as opposed a county sheriff's office, as opposed to the county sheriff himself. So first of all, we have a FCPA or anti-corruption enforcement action that's domestic, number one. And number two, we have allegations against an agency, or involving an agency, and not the head of the agency or a member of the agency. Read in conjunction with Opinion Release 2001, could this signal a new approach perhaps to FCPA enforcement, or is it something that you've seen in the past?
Well, as you say, the Apple case, or the Moyer case, was not an FCPA, it's a domestic case, but DOJ is involved, and there is a strong overlap both in language and approach to between domestic corruption and foreign corruption. I think the opinion and the Moyer case are somewhat different things. The opinion relates to can you pay a government entity for performing services and using its influence, with another government entity, or in this case, a different part of it was a state-owned bank, with which the opinion or the relator in that case, was seeking business and had obtained business, and then a different part of the bank came in and said, we want you should pay us a fee because we provided services to you to help you get that business. But and the DOJ said, well, as long as you're paying the government and it was for services, then that would seem not to raise an FCPA violation issue. We wouldn't bring a prosecution based on those facts. The Moyer or Apple case is different because there the issue is you're providing some sort of benefit to a government agency, in this case, the sheriff's office or the undersheriff's office, and in exchange for some unrelated government service. So you're not paying them to provide to provide a service. You're saying, we'll give you the iPads, and I think, and then, you'll expedite or grant our weapons permits for our security force. And so this comes in the if this was an FCPA case, then you come in and look, when I was a DOJ, prosecutor, and I know my successors have said it as well, is that you can bribe the government. You just can't bribe government officials. So that, if the government comes in and they say, we want you to build a hospital or a school or a road or dig a well, as long as that is for the government or for the community and not for the government official, you're not digging a well on the government official's, farm, that would not ordinarily be viewed as an FCPA violation. And in this case, in the Apple case, in the Moyer case, the allegations, as far as we can tell from the pleadings, is that the company provided, I think, iPads to the office itself and not to the undersheriff or the sheriff. And in that case, we would normally, if you were asked to advise in an FCPA case, we'd say, as long as you document that the benefit went to the company and that this was for the official use rather of the government agency, and you booked it properly, and that would be an acceptable benefit to the government itself and not a violation of the FCPA. Here, you may say this is sort of tacky, the company is giving a benefit to the government in order to get ahead of the line or to get, okay, but doesn't mean it's illegal. And it sort of comes back to the debate, I've had for years in the FCPA area is what does it mean to give a benefit to a government official? The statute says money or anything of value, but does that include something that's intangible, like just, giving a charitable contribution that makes the government official feel good so he's motivated to help you? Here, giving something to his agency that makes his life or his officers' lives easier, is that a benefit to the government official that can be prosecuted as corrupt? How closely do you have to tie that to some sort of personal benefit to the undersheriff here? Does this help him get promoted? Does it help him get elected? Does it get to take credit for it in a way that somehow benefits him other than just, making him feel good about you? And I don't think, look, we're still working on pleadings here, but certainly the case doesn't seem to have really developed facts that would support an allegation of corruption. Cutting corners, jumping the line, but not corruption.
So the analysis that you just walked us through, or at least some of the potential facts, are those things that companies need to start thinking about if they're going to make a donation to a foreign governmental agency, a charitable donation, or some of the other things that we've traditionally done? And I would say LBJ was always one of my heroes. And of course, some of his favorite phrases was build them a bridge, build them a road, build them a school, build them a something. And do we now need to start kind of digging deeper beyond the build them a something?
Well, if this is as a sea change in the DOJ's approach, Yes, you do. I'm not sure it is. This could be a couple cowboy AUSAs out in, the Northern District of California. It could be that there are facts that have not been developed or publicized in a way that shows, more of a link to a benefit to the sheriff or the undersheriff. But if DOJ is taking the position now that providing, this kind of benefit, look, if this had gone to the sheriff himself, I mean, if an iPad had gone to the sheriff himself in an FCPA world, you might just call this a facilitation payment. Now, facilitation payments are illegal in any country in which they're made. They're illegal. They're just not going to be prosecuted. They're an exception to the FCPA. But they're not an exception to those countries' domestic laws, and they're not an exception to our domestic law, if it was done here. But assuming that there isn't even evidence of a benefit to the official, I think, this would create a significant compliance issue for companies doing business, if this is the rule that's going to be applied in FCPA cases. I mean, we get instances all the time when companies come to us, and say, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about us making a contribution to a nature conservancy? We've done due diligence on the conservancy. Everything seems copacetic. There's no, the government official supports it, but he's not on the board. This isn't like the Polish, hospital, Polish castle cases, This is just something that we want him to feel good about us. And so we're going to do it. Or we want the community to feel good about us. Or you get these cases where local police forces ask, for very much like this, we need cell phones. Our budget doesn't cover cell phones. We need cell phones so we can communicate with, teams out in the field. Of course, if it's going into the private officials' use and they're just going to be carrying it around and this is their private cell phone, that creates a problem. But if there actually is evidence that they need this for their operational use and you make it transparent, you have a big ceremony, you hand it over, there's no secrecy. Generally, I would say that's an acceptable practice. And usually it is tied to, well, if you can do this, then we can make sure that there's security around your plant or that we respond to your cases. So there's no question that there's a link there, but is it a corrupt link if it's not a personal benefit to the police chief? So far, we've always said no. But if this case is an indication that the DOJ is changing, which I don't think it is, but if it is, then this is going to change what companies have to think about when they do compliance.
Actually, the next question arose on January 1 of 2021, but it's certainly pertinent to the discussion in 2020 and earlier, which was the National Defense Authorization Act and the Banking Secrecy Act component. And Congress overrode the president's veto on January 1, but I was wondering what your thoughts might be on the new requirements around reporting on shell corporations, ultimate beneficial owners, recognizing that under the NDA, this is largely focused on financial institutions. But could this begin to inform some of the DOJ's thinking on due diligence and what private commercial organizations may need to do in this arena? Yes, I think it will. Look, it's not altogether clear that the database or the transparency of the Delaware LLCs is going to be fully available to private, actors, as opposed to the government being able to go look and see who owns the companies. But because that there will exist some degree of transparency or reporting of the ultimate beneficial owners of Delaware LLCs, and we're seeing similar things with the EU and in the UK, and extending that out to over some objections to the BVI and Caymans. I think DOJ's view is that this idea that you can have a BVI company or a Delaware LLC company and that's all your due diligence can go to because they won't tell you who their UBOs are. I think DOJ has, I don't think they ever had a lot of patience for that, but I think they'll have even less now.
The idea is, clearly there's a trend both in the United States and outside the United States and pushed by FATF, the anti-money laundering organization, of more transparency of ultimate beneficial owners. And the last thing DOJ, the DOJ is going to want to do is be embarrassed if they, don't bring a case and then there's a Panama Papers thing and it turns out that all the companies involved were owned by government officials and, this is published on the internet. Or companies don't want that either. I think because there's this trend toward transparency, it makes it that much harder for companies to refuse the due diligence requests that should be being made. This is back. This comes back. It's very similar to what happened in Brazil, frankly, after Lava Jato. I mean, it used to be that, we tell our companies, you need to do due diligence. You need to ask these questions. You need to ask whether a government official is involved or owns the company or benefits from the company. And we were all told, you can't ask those questions. That's insulting. It's insulting to ask such a question. After Lava Jato, I can tell you, because we represent Brazilian companies as well as companies doing business in Brazil, they've got their notebooks ready to go. They are prepared to answer these questions. They understand that foreign companies have to ask these questions. And the idea that it's insulting to ask them is really not even on the table anymore. And I think that's going to be the case. NDA just lends itself to the same narrative that, this is keeping the beneficial owners secret is just not acceptable if you want to do business with us.
You touched a little bit earlier on some of your thoughts around where enforcement might be heading under a Biden administration, but I was wondering if I could ask the fraud section, or my observation is the fraud section, and certainly the FCPA unit seem to be fairly well insulated from political winds that might be blowing at the top of the Department of Justice, and they sort of move along at their own speed and pace based upon a pipeline of cases. And that coupled with the professionalism of the line prosecutors in those organizations seem to be, at least to me, one of the reasons that we've had a consistent approach to FCPA enforcement. Would that be a fair assessment? And if so, would you expect that trend to continue?
Yes, I think that's I think it's fair. I mean, the FCPA unit is made up of, career, or at least, as long as they're in the government career. I mean, there's a bit of a revolving door, but they're aggressive and have their own view of the scope of the statute that doesn't always align with the statute itself or my understanding of it. But I have never seen a political aspect to it. And, when I was in the government, and I was bringing a case that had, really some international implications in terms of, our relationship with countries in a particular region in the middle of the, the Afghan and Gulf Wars. No one ever said boo to me. And I made sure the right people knew that we were doing, we were preparing this case, and no one, in the government at the time, said, no, you shouldn't do this case because, it doesn't, it doesn't look good for us. And I've never seen any indication since. I've never, the Trump administration had the China initiative, but, the FCPA cases were already being brought about China, involving China business in China. And we still haven't really seen any FCPA cases about Chinese companies coming out. So I just don't see the political aspects of whichever administration's in control, pushing a particular agenda at the fraud section level. The independence of the fraud section or the FCPA unit, that always depends on, frankly, on whether the AAG or the deputy AAG or the fraud section head, himself or herself has a particular interest in the FCPA. When I was doing it, no one cared about it other than us, and so we did whatever we wanted. Later AAGs, had practiced in private practice and done FCPA cases, and they knew very well how important these cases could be. And I think we're more interested in being part of the resolution than perhaps in the past. But that's not political. That's just career. So,
Philip, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. We're going to link to the Shearman Sterling FCPA Digest for 2020 in our show notes. And I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. And perhaps you're correct, we need to do this more than once a year.
Well, yeah, I'm always happy to talk to you. And if anyone's listening out there that has a nice, juicy investigation, my contact information is in the digest. It's on the website. You can find me easily, and please call.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. I'm extraordinarily pleased to announce the pre-publication pre-sale of my latest book, The Compliance Handbook, Second Edition, published by LexisNexis. It will be published in April. Quite simply, this is the best single volume, single author book on compliance programs. The creation, the design, the implementation, and the enhancements of best practice compliance programs are all laid out in this book. If you're in the compliance field, in the compliance discipline, this is the book for you, far better than any other book on the market, if I may say so myself. I'm going to link to it in the show notes for pre-sale. There's also a discount. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, and I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode.